when I was still an undergraduate at McGill, long time, well, just a few years actually after that, fortunately, I had this incredible professor who taking the class on Israel, Israeli politics, Middle East. And it was still, I guess it's still debated, but it was more debated back then. Are the Palestinians a people? And I remember his answer. It was a very powerful but very simple answer. Well, the Palestinians are a people if they think that they're a people. Isn't that your position? That the Rusyns or sub-Carpathian variety of people on that territory, if there's a critical mass who think that they're a people or a nation, then they are a people or a nation, because it is, in that sense, self-determination, subjectively determined. Now, whether they will manage to create institutions and even get political recognition is a whole different ballgame.
Correct.
Is that a good rendering of your position?
This is what is known as asking the question and answering it. And it was also summed up by me in a title of one of my books, which actually was picked up by Serhiy Plokhy in the finale to his book on the Cossacks. He goes back and he says, well, are the Cossacks a nation? And he says, well, this is a question. And then he cites the title of my book, Of the Making of Nationalities, There Is No End. These are processes that will continue to go on. And the Palestinians they're already more or less established. But there will be others that will pop up.
But that was the fuse that basically ignited the second controversy. That one was public, very public, and lasted, 20, 25 years, basically, as far as you're concerned, in terms of your relationship. The fact that you were isolated in the, with some exceptions, in the organized community.
Yeah, you know, it's kind of interesting because this person who wrote this long introduction to a translation of my book, who's from Ukraine, and so he's just looking at this stuff, and he basically says that I'm wrong, that I wasn't isolated, and that during all of these years I had all of these contacts, and he has actually pointed them out. So maybe I am exaggerating a little bit on the isolation side. But inevitably I couldn't be isolated, and I had to deal with all these people, and I still deal with them today. I think the difference is that I either self-isolated myself or I felt very, very uncomfortable with the Ukrainian diaspora in the 80s, 90s, up until roughly 2010. And then in 2010, just a little bit before, things changed radically.
We'll get to that.
Okay.
We'll get to that. But you did actually, there wouldn't have been, you mentioned it, a chair of Ukrainian studies without in particular Ihor Barbin, one of those young businessmen in Toronto.
Correct.
I believe initially the father of our current donor here at the Danyliw seminar.
Also, he signed the contract.
Volodymyr George Danyliw
exactly.
was a lawyer.
His signature is in that book, absolutely.
Played
That's correct.
Instrumental role in making it possible.
Correct.
Then you do mention in your recollections, quite fondly, even if there was a fallout later on, your relationship with a major figure in, again, institutional Ukrainian studies in Canada, Petro Yatsik. You want maybe to elaborate on your friendship or relationship with Yatsik? Did he weather the storm with you during the controversy at Toronto?
Yeah, I think
he ended up, as you know, of course, giving a lot of money to Toronto and Edmonton.
Correct. One talks about this controversy before I came onto the scene, then after I came onto the scene with the creation of the chair of Ukrainian studies, and that it seems to some that the Ukrainian community in Canada was opposed to me. Well, first of all, there are no communities.
Well,
there's no one community. There are various communities, but nonetheless.
I kept mentioning the organized.
Yeah, no. But in general, I'm not saying that you do it. Everyone does it, and I do it as well. However, one very important thing. Yes, there were people who were in opposition, but within the Ukrainian community, I had some very strong supporters. some of whom I knew before and some of whom I didn't know before. So the head of the Ukrainian Professional Businessmen's Association, Ihor Bardin, was a strong supporter of mine. A very influential Greek Catholic priest in Toronto, Father Tatarin, strong supporter of mine, and then brought the Greek Catholic Bishop Boretsky, who became a very strong supporter of mine. And then there was Peter Yatzik, the one who knew me from Harvard. The reason and we became very good friends at Harvard because he was a classic, hard-nosed Galician Ukrainian businessman who couldn't tolerate laziness and couldn't tolerate non-action. And when he came to Harvard, he saw non-action. And the only person he saw who was doing something, and I became very close to the Ukrainian Studies Fund at Harvard, was me. And so before I even came here, he was my full support. He helped me get my house. He helped a whole host of things. He became the godfather of my youngest daughter, born in Toronto. So he's my cum, right? So, so I wasn't isolated. I had a few friends, and fortunately, they were the right kind, and which both they actually stood behind me, and not just verbally, but with funds to make it possible for me to do things that otherwise wouldn't have been possible. And so our relationship was very close until first the Alberta thing, because he went to Alberta instead of going to Toronto, fine. But I think the real break came, and he was an incredible supporter of mine during the Vatican controversy, and that's another controversy. It was even more interesting. But then in 1991, with the beginnings of lustration in the communist world, on the list of names that come up on security services, my name appeared in the Czechoslovak Security Services list, together with all the Ukrainianists in Czechoslovakia, together with Timothy Garton Ash, not only in Germany, but also there. So the Ukrainians, and including my friends, alleged in Toronto, who had become my friends, accepted this lock, stock, and barrel, and then accused me of being an agent of the Czechoslovak Secret Services. And then it all, in the end, it all came out, because I had to, this was unpleasant. But, all came out that I had been an agent. These are silly terms, but I had been interrogated ever since the 1960s as an undergraduate by the FBI, by the CIA, then by the Czechoslovak Security Services, then by the KGB, and the last two services that I've had contact with are the Ukrainian, the SBU and the French Security Services.
Because?
So you're talking here to someone who really, you better be careful. Because why?
Because your wife was from Czechoslovakia, wasn't it? And you were visiting. I mean, that's the reason that you.
Well, that's how I got drawn into it. Yeah,
that's the reason.
Yeah, but they had followed me. They had followed me already from 1967 because I got the Czechoslovakia, unlike the Soviet Ukraine or Ukraine and any of those post-Soviet states, went through full lustration, and so you can get your files, whether you're a citizen or whether. And I got my file, which is 368 pages, 67 dossier, that goes back to 1967, well before I was even married, because I had started going there then.
That's the time of the Banderai girlfriend, or before?
That was just a little bit after.
Let's see. Unfortunately, we will run out of time in terms of covering all the controversy, but there is one that, again, made you a bit in hot waters and then turned you into some kind of hit at the University of Toronto in the 1980s and with the community. That was your decision, actually, to partner with a, let's say, rival association of Ukrainians in Canada, so that you rival to the established ones, so that you could actually invite scholars or literature persons literary figures from Soviet Ukraine to give basically presentations in the 1980s at the University of Toronto.
And
How did it become from a controversy to actually a success? You actually brought people together.
well, yeah. Okay. I guess the basic principle was the following. I didn't then and do not have any political convictions, and so on the one hand, where we ran an incredibly successful 4-day conference on Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky, which then brought me to the attention of the Vatican and a whole other host of problems surrounding the millennium. But that was an enormous success, ingratiated me with many of our Greek Catholic friends. I don't think I ever partnered with any other group, but there was a young professor running around in Western Canada who was a left-leaning
Indirectly.
type. Yeah,
Okay,
exactly.
indirectly.
And this was the time when the Soviets wanted to, in the later détente period, show that they're liberal and would send scholars and writers to Canada for Shevchenko readings, but they could only be speaking in basements of churches. Well, pardon, slip that, no churches in that world. Community halls, community centers, and so this woman wanted to get them to be able to speak at universities, and she turned to several people in Canada, various universities in Canada, including the Slavic Department, University of Toronto, and they wouldn't have anything to do with it. And so she comes to me, and I'm easy. Well, why not? And so then
So you hosted Ivan
a whole-
Drac, Dmitro
a whole host-
Pavlichko.
a whole host of people.
But years before they became stars in Ukraine. And
Well,
political
Drac
stars
was
in-
already a star. He was a member of the 60s groups, and so was Pavlichko. They later became, no, they were dissidents when I knew them. They became nationalists after, and then they turned on me. That's a different story. The point is this is the time they were dissidents, so they were beloved, including Zuba. Zuba never turned on me. Zuba, we remained friends till the end. So we had a whole host of these people, and I hosted them. And then Grabovich from Harvard, this was an opportunity for him, so he flew up, and it was actually him and I who were now hosting these people at the University of Toronto because they couldn't go to the United States. This was post-Afghanistan, and were banned. The Soviets were banned from entering the United States, so they came to Canada. The soft spot, the soft belly. So they come to the University of Toronto. We meet all of these people, and that was it. But it was also followed very closely by that's the Canadian services. I forgot them too. So they would interview me or interrogate me or question me about these kind of people, etc. So that's how that happened.
So the Soviet Union falls apart, Ukraine becomes independent, and the Magocsi Russian controversy migrates to Ukraine, and you just alluded to they turned on me as basically you were not exactly fully welcome with open arms for a while in Ukraine until, if I recollect correctly from your recollections, until the translation of your classic History of Ukraine book that came out in English in 1996 and in Ukraine a decade later. It seems to have broken the dams in Ukraine. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that is partially the case. First of all, I did not realize to the degree to which some of my writings were already known in Ukraine and in post-Soviet Ukraine. But then when that history was, the first edition of it, the 1996 edition that was published by Kritika in Ukrainian in 2007, and then the expanded edition, 2010, was also released in Ukrainian. But after the first edition, to my surprise, the Historical Institute at the Academy of Sciences, Smolny, organized a basically book launch for it, in which Alexei Tolochko spoke and Kulchitsky spoke, and it was a packed audience. And it became clear that some of the things that I write were not only being read, but being appreciated. And I then continued to have exceedingly warm relations with the Historical Institute. And then after we did after the second edition came out, we did a major tour, which is extraordinary. We went to 21 cities and did book launches. In fact, that's how I met one of my colleagues sitting here. He hosted us in Kharkiv, correct? Not once, but twice. I can't even remember. There's so many times. Which books?
That's
right?
Artem Harchenko, who will be presenting tomorrow morning.
Exactly. And so, and we did 21 cities throughout the country, and this galved from Luhansk to Rivne to Sumy to God knows where, to Simferopol, etc. And so this turned things around. And it's also another interesting question. I'll just, if I may, comment on this. During that period of time when I kind of felt alienated from the Ukrainian world, I also took another very strong position, and that is there's enough problem researching and writing in your native language, let alone getting involved with translations. And my position was, I'm just going to write in English and publish in English, and that's it. If people can't read English, that's their problem. That was my position. And I got forced out of that position by a young woman who came to work for the chair and who had experienced or learned about me in her homeland in Ukraine, and said that and she herself was a Ukrainian patriot, and pushed me very hard to commit myself to having things published in Ukrainian in Ukraine, and then, when it is now possible, because it wasn't possible under Soviet times, promote things there, go there, interact, participate, etc. And that was a major change, actually, that took place, I would say, 2005, 2006. And now it hasn't ended. On the other hand, I am overburdened, and I spend an inordinate amount of times having to proofread and check maps. If you're doing atlases or maps, and people may know that I'm a cartographer, actually, not a historian. But the amount of time that it takes, and I have to kill myself with spending this time with Ukrainian translations, Polish translations. I have now 2 books coming out one already came out in Turkish, another one's coming out in Turkish, in Slovak.
You're going global.
Well, it's not. It's very demanding. It's very demanding because you're not producing anything new, really. But if you make the decision to try to reach a larger audience, well, then this is what you got to do. I mean, before my decision was I couldn't care less. It's not my problem. I only doing English. But once you make the decision and then another thing, and I'll mention to all you young scholars here, whatever you do, you create yourself a niche. But one thing, never forget this, as most scholars, senior, do. They do research, they write a book, and they wash their hands. They try to get a publisher, they'll get a publisher. There are 3 phases in the academic publishing world. Writing the research and writing, publishing it in the best format, and then marketing it. Do you know which is the most difficult and the most important? Marketing. Writing it is easy. But most scholars, young and old, feel so self-important that they're not going to touch themselves with the latter stages. They're the intelligent ones who have created something unique. It's for the others. And if you do not do the 3rd phase, you don't exist, except for maybe 300 copies of a book that are in some libraries. Now, it is true, some of you are going to say, well, now we can get it on the internet and anyone can read it. And maybe you're right. But still, to make yourself interesting, you have to promote what you do in one form or another, actively and aggressively.